The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse as Sarah Mitchell checked her watch for the third time. It was 8:45 a.m., and her traffic court hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock a.m. She always made it a point to arrive early, a habit that had served her well throughout her distinguished career. Sarah adjusted her navy blue blazer and smoothed down her pencil skirt, professional attire she wore not for the traffic court, but for the important judicial board meeting she had scheduled later that afternoon. At 42 years old, she carried herself with quiet confidence, earned through years of excellence in law practice and public service. The courthouse lobby was already bustling with activity. Security guards directed people through metal detectors while clerks hurried past with stacks of files. Sarah noticed how some people glanced at her, a well-dressed black woman who seemed out of place in traffic court. She was used to these looks, having dealt with them throughout her career, from law school to boardrooms. The elevator ride to the third floor was crowded with other citizens reporting for various court appearances. An elderly white woman clutched her purse tighter when Sarah stepped in, a subtle action that didn't escape Sarah's notice. She simply smiled politely, having learned long ago that changing minds happen through actions, not reactions. Courtroom 3C was already half full when she entered. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted to make room for newcomers. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, placing her leather briefcase beside her. The air conditioning hummed overhead, barely managing to keep the room comfortable as more people filed in. A young court clerk, probably in his mid-twenties, was organizing files at the front desk. He looked nervous, possibly new to the job, dropping papers twice as he arranged the morning's cases. Sarah watched him with sympathy, remembering her own early days in the legal system. At precisely 9 o'clock a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed through the room. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Robert Henderson presiding." The shuffling of feet and rustling of clothes filled the air as everyone stood. Sarah observed Judge Henderson as he walked in, his black robe flowing behind him. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades behind the bench. Sarah's case was third on the docket. She listened as Judge Henderson handled the first two cases, a speeding ticket and an expired registration. His tone was curt, his decision swift and harsh. He showed little patience for explanations, cutting off both defendants mid-sentence. Sarah made mental notes, not as a defendant, but as someone who had spent years working to improve the judicial system. When the clerk called Sarah Mitchell, case number TR 2024-783, she walked confidently to the podium. The clicking of her heels on the tile floor echoed through the now quiet courtroom. She carried with her a folder containing photographs of the parking spot in question, along with documentation about unclear signage that had confused many other drivers. Judge Henderson barely looked up from his papers. "Miss Mitchell, you're here contesting a parking violation from March 15th at 2:45 p.m. on Madison Avenue. How do you plead?" Sarah noticed his tone was different from his usual gruffness. It was almost dismissive, as if her case wasn't worth his full attention. She stood straighter, her Harvard law training kicking in. "Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances. The signage at that location is problematic, and I have documentation showing." "Miss Mitchell," Judge Henderson interrupted, finally looking up but only briefly. "The sign clearly states no parking between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. This seems rather straightforward. Unless you have evidence that your vehicle was not there at the time stated in the citation, I don't see any basis for contest." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. In just a few hours, she would be sitting in a very different capacity at the State Judicial Board meeting, where her opinion would carry considerable weight. But here, in this moment, she was just another face in traffic court, being subjected to the very kind of treatment she had been working to change in the system. Little did Judge Henderson know that this seemingly routine traffic court session would become a turning point in his career, and in the local judicial system's approach to equal treatment under the law. Judge Henderson shifted in his leather chair, glancing at the clock on the courtroom wall. It was only 9:15 a.m., and he already had a headache. He had handled 12 cases that morning, and Sarah Mitchell's case was just another number on his busy docket. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he looked down at her file with tired eyes. Sarah stood at the podium, holding her documentation with steady hands. She had dealt with difficult judges before, but something about Judge Henderson's dismissive attitude made her legal training kick in. As she tried to speak again, she noticed how he drummed his fingers impatiently on his desk. Your Honor, if I may present evidence regarding the confusing nature of the signage, Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. The other people in the courtroom watched with interest. Most traffic court sessions moved quickly, but something about this interaction caught their attention. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Henderson cut her off again, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. I've been presiding over cases in this courthouse for 23 years. I'm quite familiar with every traffic sign in this district. He adjusted his glasses and gave her a look that suggested she was wasting his time. The young clerk at the desk nearby looked uncomfortable, shifting papers around unnecessarily. He had seen Judge Henderson be stern before, but today seemed different. The judge's tone carried an edge that made even the bailiff glance up from his usual stoic position. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had faced similar treatment. Your Honor, I have photographs showing how the temporary construction signs partially block the permanent parking restriction sign. Several other drivers have reported. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Henderson's voice echoed through the courtroom. Several people in the audience jumped slightly. This court's time is valuable. The fact remains that you parked in a restricted zone. Your attempts to complicate a simple matter with irrelevant details suggest a lack of respect for this court's authority. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the unfair treatment. She had spent years mastering the art of maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice, but this particular instance would prove more significant than anyone in the room could guess. Judge Henderson picked up his gavel, barely looking at Sarah as he delivered his verdict. Given your obvious disregard for traffic regulations and your attempt to waste this court's time with unnecessary arguments, I am imposing the maximum fine of $500. Additionally, I'm adding a $50 court fee for prolonging these proceedings. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The maximum fine for a parking violation was rarely imposed, especially for first-time offenders. The young clerk looked down at his desk, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Sarah remained poised, though her fingers tightened slightly around her folder. Thank you, Your Honor, she said calmly, her voice carrying no hint of the frustration she felt. She noticed how Judge Henderson had already turned his attention to the next case file, dismissing her presence entirely. As she walked back to her seat to gather her belongings, Sarah could feel the sympathetic glances from others in the courtroom. A young law student who had been taking notes for a class assignment looked at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. He had never seen such a harsh penalty for a simple parking violation. Judge Henderson called the next case, already forgetting about Sarah Mitchell. In his mind, she was just another person trying to avoid responsibility for their actions. He had no idea that in just a few hours, his entire perspective would change dramatically. Sarah collected her briefcase and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. She checked her phone. There were 3 messages from the State Judicial Board Secretary confirming the afternoon's meeting. A slight smile crossed her face as she thought about the unexpected lesson in judicial conduct she had just experienced firsthand. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind her, neither Sarah nor Judge Henderson realized that this brief interaction would soon become a catalyst for significant changes in the state's judicial system. The next few hours would transform a simple traffic court session into a powerful lesson about prejudice, power, and the importance of fair treatment under the law. Judge Robert Henderson straightened his bow tie as he walked toward the State Judicial Board meeting room. It was 2:30 p.m., and his morning in traffic court felt far away. The top floor of the State Justice Building was quiet compared to the busy courthouse, its thick carpets muffling his footsteps. As head of the county court system, he attended these quarterly meetings regularly. They were usually boring affairs filled with budget discussions and policy updates. Today's agenda included reviewing new guidelines for judicial conduct, something he felt he hardly needed after 23 years on the bench. The assistant at the desk smiled as he approached. "Good afternoon, Judge Henderson. They're waiting for you in the main conference room." He nodded, noticing how she seemed a bit more nervous than usual. Later, he would realize why. Taking a deep breath, Judge Henderson pushed open the heavy wooden doors to the conference room. The familiar faces of board members turned to greet him, but then he saw her. His hand froze on the doorknob. There, sitting in one of the leather chairs at the main table, was Sarah Mitchell. She wasn't wearing the same clothes from traffic court. She had changed into a dark gray suit that practically screamed authority. A golden nameplate sat in front of her. Sarah Mitchell, JG, head of Judicial Conduct Committee. The blood drained from Judge Henderson's face. His legs felt weak as he tried to maintain his composure. Sarah's eyes met his, showing no emotion, though she had clearly recognized him. The other board members, unaware of their morning encounter, continued their casual conversations. "Robert, please join us," called out Thomas Wright, the board chairman. "I believe you haven't met our newest committee head. Sarah Mitchell joined us 3 months ago from Harvard Law School's ethics department. She's been doing remarkable work on our judicial reform initiatives." Judge Henderson's throat felt dry as he walked to his seat. By some cruel twist of fate, the only empty chair was directly across from Sarah. You could feel sweat forming on his forehead as he sat down. "Actually," Sarah spoke up, her voice calm and professional, "Judge Henderson and I had an interesting interaction just this morning in his traffic court." The room fell silent. Several board members looked up from their papers with interest. Chairman Wright raised his eyebrows. "Oh, I wasn't aware you had a case in traffic court, Sarah." "Yes," she replied, opening a folder in front of her. "It was quite educational. In fact, it relates directly to our first agenda item today, the new guidelines on judicial conduct and implicit bias in the courtroom." Judge Henderson wished his chair would swallow him whole. His mind raced back through every dismissive word, every interruption, every assumption he had made that morning. The security camera footage from his courtroom would be available to the board. His treatment of Sarah would be there for all to see. Sarah pulled out a document, the same one she had tried to show him in court. "I thought we might use my experience today as a case study. It demonstrates several points in our new guidelines quite effectively." The other board members leaned forward, intrigued. Judge Henderson noticed how some of them were already taking notes. His decades-old reputation for being tough but fair was about to be seriously questioned. "Before we begin," Sarah continued, her voice steady, "I want to make it clear that this isn't about personal grievance. This is about improving our system." She looked directly at Judge Henderson, and for a moment, he saw not the anger he expected, but something more powerful, determination for change. Chairman Wright nodded approvingly. "This is exactly why we brought you onto the board, Sarah. Real experiences like this are invaluable for our reform efforts." Judge Henderson sat there, feeling the weight of every hasty judgment he'd made that morning. The irony was suffocating. Just hours ago, he had refused to listen to this woman's evidence. Now she held his professional reputation in her hands. As Sarah began her presentation, displaying photographs of the partially hidden parking signs he had refused to look at, Judge Henderson realized this afternoon would change not just his career, but his entire understanding of justice. The lesson in humility was just beginning, and the prestigious boardroom of the State Judicial Building would become the classroom he never knew he needed. Judge Robert Henderson sat alone in his study at 2:30 a.m., still wearing his work clothes from the previous day. The only light came from his desk lamp, casting shadows on the wall full of legal certificates and awards. His usual evening scotch sat untouched beside him. The events of the day kept playing in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah Mitchell's face, both as the woman he had dismissed in traffic court and as the respected board member she truly was. His stomach turned every time he remembered his own harsh words. His wife, Linda, had noticed something was wrong when he came home. He barely touched his dinner and went straight to his study. "Robert, come to bed," she had said around midnight. But he couldn't. How could he explain to her that everything he thought about himself as a judge was now in question? The board meeting had been brutal in its politeness. Sarah Mitchell had presented her case with perfect professionalism, never raising her voice or showing anger. That somehow made it worse. She had methodically gone through his conduct, comparing it to the new judicial guidelines. His interruptions, his dismissive tone, his refusal to look at evidence. Everything was laid bare before his peers. Judge Henderson opened his laptop and began searching through his past cases. His hands shook slightly as he typed in different names, dates, and case numbers. As the hours passed, a disturbing pattern emerged. His sentences for minority defendants were consistently harsher, his interruptions more frequent, his fines higher. How did I not see this? He whispered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. The data was right there. 23 years of subtle bias, hidden behind what he had called being tough on crime and maintaining courtroom efficiency. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. Judge Henderson stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the quiet suburban street below. A police car rolled by slowly, its lights off. He thought about how many times he had automatically believed an officer's testimony over a defendant's, especially when the defendant was a person of color. His phone lit up with a text message. It was from his daughter Amy, a second-year law student. "Dad, you okay? Mom said you seemed upset at dinner. Want to talk?" He stared at the message, wondering what Amy would think if she knew. She had always been proud of him, always bragging about her father, the judge. Sitting back at his desk, Judge Henderson pulled out a legal pad and began to write. He needed to make this right, but a simple apology wouldn't be enough. Sarah Mitchell deserved more than that. The whole system deserved more than that. As he wrote, memories from his early days as a lawyer flooded back. He had started with such ideals about justice and fairness. Somewhere along the way, he had let bias creep in, let assumptions cloud his judgment. The very things he had sworn to fight against had become part of his daily routine. The first light of dawn was starting to show through his window when he finally finished writing. The yellow pad was filled with notes, ideas for changes in his courtroom, plans for reviewing past cases, proposals for new procedures. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about fixing a deeper problem. Judge Henderson finally stood up, his joints stiff from sitting all night. He had another full docket of cases today, but for the first time in years, he felt uncertain about taking the bench. How many more Sarah Mitchells had stood before him, their stories unheard, their evidence ignored? As he walked upstairs to shower and change, he passed the family photos hanging on the wall. 23 years of proud moments, his swearing-in ceremony, community awards, charity events. Each image now carried a new weight, a question about what he hadn't seen, what he hadn't wanted to see. But amid the guilt and regret, a small spark of hope was growing. Maybe this humbling experience, this painful revelation, could lead to something positive. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just exposed his bias, she had given him an opportunity to change. The question was, would he have the courage to take it? Over the next 3 weeks, Judge Henderson's office looked more like a research lab than a judge's chambers. Stacks of case files covered every surface, and his computer screen displayed spreadsheets filled with data from his past rulings. His secretary, Mrs. Thompson, had never seen him arrive so early or leave so late. "Your Honor," she said one morning, bringing in his 3rd cup of coffee, the courthouse cleaning staff asked if you're living here now. She noticed dark circles under his eyes and wrinkles in his usually crisp shirt. The prestigious judge she had known for 12 years seemed changed. Judge Henderson barely looked up from the file he was reviewing. It was a case from 3 years ago, a young black man he'd sentenced to 6 months for a minor offense. Next to it lay a similar case involving a white college student whom he'd given only community service. The contrast made his stomach turn. He had hired 2 law students, both from minority backgrounds, to help him review his past decade of rulings. The patterns they uncovered were impossible to ignore. Race, gender, and appearance had influenced his decisions more than he ever wanted to admit. One rainy Tuesday, he called an unexpected meeting with his entire courtroom staff, the bailiff, clerks, and stenographer. They sat nervously in his chambers, wondering what had prompted this unusual gathering. "We need to change how we operate," he announced, standing before them with determination in his voice. "I prepared new guidelines for our courtroom procedures." He handed out folders containing his proposals. "From now on, every defendant gets equal time to speak. Every piece of evidence must be reviewed. No exceptions." The bailiff, Officer Martinez, raised his hand. "Sir, won't this make the court calendar run longer?" "Then it runs longer," Judge Henderson replied firmly. "Justice isn't about efficiency. It's about fairness." He thought about Sarah Mitchell, remembering how quickly he had dismissed her evidence. He implemented small but significant changes. The podium where defendants stood was raised till they could be at eye level with him. He required all names to be covered on initial case reviews to prevent bias. Every decision had to be accompanied by a written explanation of the reasoning. Some of his fellow judges noticed the changes. During lunch in the judge's dining room, Judge Peterson, this friend of 20 years, confronted him. Rob, what's gotten into you? Peterson asked, cutting into his steak. I heard you spent 2 hours on a simple shoplifting case yesterday. You're making the rest of us look bad. Judge Henderson put down his fork and looked his friend in the eye. Maybe we need to look bad, he replied. Maybe we need to question everything we think we know about being good judges. At home, his wife Linda noticed the change too. Instead of watching evening news, he was reading books about implicit bias and systemic racism. Their dinner conversations had shifted from golf scores to discussions about judicial reform. One evening, she found him in his study, writing what looked like a speech. What's that for? She asked, bringing him a cup of tea. I'm presenting my findings to the State Judicial Board next month, he explained. About bias in our courts. About my bias. His voice cracked slightly. I found over 300 cases where I need to recommend sentence reviews. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. Robert, you're doing the right thing. He covered her hand with his. I'm just getting started, he said softly. This goes beyond my courtroom. We need systemic change. The next morning, Judge Henderson did something unprecedented. He posted a public notice in his courtroom inviting feedback from anyone who felt they had been treated unfairly in his court. The suggestion box he installed quickly filled up with letters. Each evening, he read every single one. Some made him wince. Others made him angry at himself. But each letter strengthened his resolve to create real change. The same dedication that had once made him a respected judge was now focused on becoming a fair one. As he worked late into another night, he realized that Sarah Mitchell hadn't just exposed his bias, she had given him the most important case of his career, the case for transformation. Judge Henderson stood outside Sarah Mitchell's office on the 12th floor of the State Justice Building. His hand hesitated over the door's sleek nameplate that reads Sarah Mitchell, JT, Head of Judicial Conduct Committee. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now his prepared speech felt inadequate. Sarah's assistant had seemed surprised when he called to request a meeting. Now, at 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, he was actually here. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding like a young lawyer at his first court appearance. Come in, Sarah's clear voice called from inside. Her office was impressive, but not showy. Large windows overlooked the city, and the walls held degrees from Harvard Law School and various legal awards. Sarah sat behind a modern desk, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed some documents. Judge Henderson, she said, looking up. Her voice was professional but guarded. Please have a seat. He sat in one of the chairs facing her desk, noticing a framed photo of Sarah with Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Another showed her receiving an award for her work in judicial reform. Ms. Mitchell, he began and corrected himself. Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. His hands felt sweaty, reminding him of the day in the boardroom when everything had changed. Sarah removed her reading glasses and folded them carefully. What can I do for you, Judge Henderson? He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, not a legal brief or court document, but the results of his 3-week review. First, I owe you an apology, not just for that day in traffic court, but for what that day represented. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral but attentive. The city sounds drifted up from 12 stories below as Judge Henderson continued. I've spent the last 3 weeks reviewing my cases, he said, opening the folder. The patterns of bias are clear and undeniable. Your case wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. He handed her the folder. Inside were statistics, case reviews, and his detailed plans for reform. Sarah took her time examining each page, her expression shifting from surprise to interest. You did all this because of our encounter, she asked, looking up from the documents. Your case opened my eyes, he admitted. But I did this because it was right, because I've been part of the problem for too long. Sarah stood up and walked to her office window, looking out at the city below. Do you know why I decided to contest that parking ticket, Judge Henderson? He shook his head. Because I knew that courtroom would be full of people who needed to see someone stand up to unfair treatment. She turned to face him. I didn't expect to change your mind that day. I just wanted those watching to know they weren't alone. Judge Henderson felt the weight of her words. I've been a judge for 23 years, he said quietly. I thought I knew what justice looked like. I was wrong. Sarah returned to her desk and pulled out her own folder. I've been watching your court since that day, she revealed. My assistants have noted the changes you've implemented. The raised podium, the blind case reviews, the community feedback box. He looked surprised. She had been monitoring his efforts all along. Change isn't just about admitting mistakes, Sarah continued. It's about doing the hard work to fix them. She paused, studying him carefully. And it seems you're willing to do that work. I am, he said firmly. But I need help. Your help, if you're willing to give it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen thoughtfully on her desk. The same pen she had used to take notes during that traffic court session that now felt like a lifetime ago. Judge Henderson, she finally said, what you're proposing isn't easy. It means admitting publicly that you've made mistakes. It means facing criticism from your peers. It means completely reimagining how you conduct your court. I know, he nodded. And I'm ready for all of it. A slight smile appeared on Sarah's face, the first he had seen since that day in traffic court. Then perhaps, she said, reaching for her calendar, we have something to build on. The conference room on the 8th floor of the State Justice Building buzzed with energy. 6 months had passed since Judge Henderson's apology, and what started as a simple parking ticket had grown into something remarkable. Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of 30 judges from across the state. Today, she announced, we're launching the Judicial Fairness Initiative. Behind her, a screen displayed the program's logo, a balanced scale with the words equal justice, equal treatment beneath it. Judge Henderson sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly. The program they had created together was unlike anything the state's judicial system had seen before. Sarah's legal expertise combined with Judge Henderson's first-hand experience had produced something powerful and practical. Each of you, Sarah continued, walking between the rows of seated judges, will participate in our 3-month training program. You'll review your past cases, learn about implicit bias, and implement new courtroom procedures. Some of the older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Change wasn't easy, especially for those who had been on the bench for decades. Judge Peterson, Henderson's old friend, raised his hand. And what if we find problems in our past rulings? He asked nervously. Judge Henderson stood up to answer this one. Then we faced them, he said firmly. I found over 300 cases that needed review in my court alone. It wasn't easy, but every corrected mistake is a step toward real justice. The program they had designed was comprehensive. Each morning began with bias recognition training. Afternoons were spent reviewing real cases, analyzing decisions, and learning new procedures. They brought in experts from around the country, psychologists, civil rights attorneys, and reform judges like Henderson. Sarah had insisted on including community involvement. Every week, people who had faced bias in the courts shared their stories. The judges listened to experiences they had never considered before. One day, during a break between sessions, Sarah found Judge Henderson staring at a wall of photos they had created, pictures of people whose cases had been reviewed and corrected through their program. Sometimes I still think about that morning in traffic court, he said quietly. How differently things could have gone if I had just listened. Sarah stood beside him. That morning gave us this. She gestured to the room full of learning materials and case studies. Sometimes the best lessons come from our hardest moments. The initiative grew beyond their expectations. Local news stations ran stories about judges voluntarily reviewing their past cases. Law schools requested their training materials. Other states began calling, asking how they could implement similar programs. They worked late many nights, refining procedures and responding to questions from courts across the country. One evening, as they reviewed feedback from the latest training session, Sarah's assistant brought in a letter. It's from the state Supreme Court, she said excitedly. Sarah opened it, her eyes scanning the page quickly. They want to make our training mandatory for all judges in the state, she announced. Not just recommended, required. Judge Henderson smiled, remembering how this all started with his own resistance to change. Now he was helping lead it. We're really doing this, he said, almost in disbelief. We are, Sarah agreed, but we're just getting started. She was right. Their initiative had revealed deeper issues that needed addressing. They began developing specialized training for different types of courts: criminal, family, civil. Each area had its own unique challenges and biases to overcome. The most powerful moment came when they held their first graduation ceremony for judges who had completed the program. 50 judges, including Henderson, received certificates. But more importantly, they had statistics showing real change. More equal sentencing, fewer appeals, and higher public trust in the courts. As Sarah watched the judges taking their certificates, she thought about that morning in traffic court. Her decision to contest that ticket had led to something far bigger than herself. She had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Judge Henderson caught her eye from across the room and nodded. They both knew that while they had made significant progress, their work was far from over. But for the first time, real change felt possible in a system that had resisted it for so long. 1 year after the parking ticket incident, the Jefferson County Courthouse looked different. The changes weren't just physical, though the raised podium and new community suggestion box were visible signs of progress. The real transformation was in how justice was served within its walls. Judge Henderson sat in his chambers, reviewing his morning docket. Next to his computer stood a small award, the Excellence in Judicial Reform trophy he and Sarah had received last month at the National Judicial Conference. But it wasn't the award that made him proud, it was the statistics on his screen. In 1 year, appeal rates in his court had dropped by 70%. Satisfaction surveys showed that 89% of people who appeared before him felt they had been treated fairly, regardless of their background. The numbers told a story of real change. Sarah Mitchell's office had also changed. Her walls now displayed framed newspaper articles about their Judicial Fairness Initiative. State program becomes national model, read one headline. Another showed a photo of her and Judge Henderson speaking at a conference, titled From Conflict to Collaboration, How One Traffic Ticket Changed the System. That morning, they both attended a special session of traffic court, the same courtroom where their story had begun. But today was different. Judge Henderson sat in the gallery while a new judge, one who had completed their training program, presided. A young Hispanic woman approached the podium, nervous about contesting her ticket. The judge listened carefully to her explanation, reviewed her evidence, and made a fair decision based on the facts. Sarah and Judge Henderson exchanged knowing looks. This was what justice should look like. During the lunch break, they walked to the small cafe across from the courthouse. It had become their weekly tradition, meeting to discuss progress and plan next steps. "Did you see the data from other states?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee. 3 more have adopted our program. Texas is starting next month." Judge Henderson nodded, remembering how resistant he had once been to change. "You know what surprised me most this year?" he said. "How many judges actually wanted to change? They just didn't know how." Their program had expanded beyond bias training. It now included mental health support for judges, community feedback sessions, and regular case review panels. Other courthouses had started copying their model, creating their own raised podiums and blind case review systems. As they finished lunch, a woman approached their table. She looked familiar to Judge Henderson, and then he remembered. She had been in the gallery the day he had fined Sarah. "I was there that day," she said, confirming his memory. "I bring my law students to court every semester. Now I bring them to see how things have changed, to show them that change is possible." That afternoon, Sarah and Judge Henderson met with a group of new judges starting their training. The room was full of eager faces, some nervous, all ready to learn. Judge Henderson stood to address them. "A year ago," he began, "I thought I knew everything about being a good judge. I was wrong. Real justice isn't about being tough or efficient. It's about being fair, being humble, and being willing to change." Sarah watched from the back of the room, thinking about how far they had come. The parking ticket that could have been just another story of injustice had instead become a catalyst for transformation. As the day ended, they stood on the courthouse steps. The setting sun cast long shadows across the words carved in stone above the entrance. "Equal justice under law." "You know," Sarah said, "when I contested that ticket, I never imagined this would happen." Judge Henderson smiled. "When I fined you that day, I never imagined I'd end up thanking you for it." They looked out at the busy street, watching people coming and going from the courthouse. Each person entering those doors now had a better chance at fair treatment, not because of luck or privilege, but because 2 people had turned a moment of conflict into an opportunity for change. The story of the white judge and the black woman board member had become more than a tale of bias confronted. It had become a blueprint for change, a reminder that justice could be more than just a word carved in stone. It could be a reality, built one courtroom, one decision, one changed mind at a time.